Hi, everybody. Welcome to our second Story Slam of Temple Emanu-El. For those of you who were here for Rabbi Fell's installation, you know that we talked a lot about stories of transformation and things that we had a number of speakers talking about how their lives were transformed by certain moments. And what happened at that time is I asked a certain number of people, and I asked them for a specific reason, and then none of them told stories of the things that I thought they would tell stories about. Same thing happened here. We're going to have 5 amazing stories about transformation, about change, and adaptation to change. We thought it was a timely subject, given what we're all going through right now. And so our first speaker is well known to all of us. He's been a Temple Emanu-El member for about 39 years or so. We all know and love Kenny Hirsch. He's, I will tell a quick story about how I met Kenny. Kenny and Leah and Sam and I joined the Temple around the same time, and there was a new members breakfast, and across the room I saw this big burly guy holding an infant of 5 weeks old in a snuggly. And his wife had a hyphenated name, and the fact that he was being the caretaker and she had the hyphenated last name, I walked over to them. I said, we're going to have to be friends. And we've been friends ever since. So it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Kenny to be the first speaker. Unlike most speakers, Kenny has been given dispensation to have his story read, and you'll find out why as soon as the camera is off of me and on him. You have to unmute yourself, sweetheart, darling.
Doing it, okay. So we're gonna just start with Kenny for a second.
Good evening. I am pleased that Pam asked me to participate. Rather than have the iPad drone on in a monotone, Leah has graciously agreed to read it for me. My name is Kenny Hirsch and I approve of this message.
So Kenny's wrote this, and I'm going to read it, obviously not in his voice. It's called Accommodation Without Surrender. About 15 years ago, I was diagnosed with a very rare neurological disease called primary lateral sclerosis. PLS is a motor neuron disease, which is in the same family as ALS, but mostly affects the upper motor neurons. It's not fatal like ALS, and it is very slowly progressive. It is actually much rarer than ALS, with only about 2,000 cases in the United States. It presents differently in different people, but usually affects mobility, speech, swallowing, and some difficulty controlling emotions. So what changes, or as I prefer to say, what accommodations have I had to make over the last decade and a half? There are many, both emotionally and physically. Mobility. I started to use a cane once my walking became unsteady. I then switched to trekking poles to be safer, and then I graduated to a walker, which I currently use to get around. Ice and snow and uneven surfaces pose a danger to me, so I have to be cautious. When we travel, I never even thought about accessibility, but now I do. Going to a house that I have never been to before, are there railings on the stairs going into the house? What's the bathroom like? Can I get in using my walker? How about chairs? Any chairs with arms that are not too low or too soft, and that I won't have to call AAA to get out of my chair? How about a restaurant? Can I get into it? What is the seating like? What's the bathroom like? How about a hotel or a resort? We have booked accessible rooms many times, only to find them less than accessible. We stayed in a fancy schmancy resort on a business trip a year ago in Miami with 1,000 other participants. The accessible room was anything but. No grab bars near the toilet, nor any grab bars in the shower. When we said something to the hotel, they apologized, but they said that was an accessible room. Even at Temple Emanu-El, have you tried to go from the chapel to the meeting house with a walker or a wheelchair and never thought about those 2 sets of stairs going from the office to the next level? Handicap parking on the steep hill of Session Street, it's not so much fun for me. Have you ever thought about these issues? I certainly never did before I entered the neuro world. Communication. I am a talker. I love to talk and ask questions of folks I know, and even those I don't know. My kids used to joke that I could have a conversation with a corpse. As my speech became nearly unintelligible, I had to resort to alternative methods. Email and my constant companion, my iPad, is how I mostly communicate. I thank Steve Jobs every day for saving my ass and allowing me to participate in life. I also use a relay phone for phone calls. It's the same device that hearing impaired people use, but I'm able to hear the person with whom I'm talking to, and the operator speaks what I type out on a special keyboard. The operators are supposed to be just my mouthpiece, but I try to make them laugh with an occasional F-bomb and really drive them nuts by typing Yiddish and Hebrew words into the conversation. Some of you who are watching may have already had the delight of having a conversation with me on a relay phone call. The emotional roller coaster. There is a fairly common issue with many neuro diseases called pseudobulbar affect. It's called PBA and is marked by the inability to control emotions such as laughing and crying. I may be sitting in shul and I'm having a conversation on my iPad with someone when something funny is said. I begin to laugh and I can't stop. The other person is able to control their laughter, but I am hysterically laughing. It does seem humorous now, but when it occurs in shul or at a meeting or someplace else, it can be quite devastating to me. I easily cry. The trigger can be a movie or a TV show, but it can also be a newspaper article or even a post on Facebook. Funerals and weddings can be fertile grounds for this type of episode. I go to Mass General for neuro appointments. They have a whole department dedicated to neuromotor disease. Being that neurology is the area of medicine that is still in the ice age, I volunteer for many studies when they're doing things for motor neuron diseases. One of the studies that I participated in was a study to control the PBA emotional part. It was successful, and I now take that medication before weddings and funerals. Strategizing. I have to think about things much more readily than most people. I call it strategizing. If I'm going to the store to get something, what is the easiest way to communicate? A pre-written note, a note on my iPad or my phone? How do I carry the item once I bought it? No more plastic bags with handles, which were very helpful. So how do I get the item to my car? Going for takeout coffee, how do I get the coffee into the car without a spill? Remember, I'm using 2 hands on my walker. A drive-up window, good suggestion, but how to place an order through a speaker if I'm unable to speak. A number of years ago, I was at a doctor's office for an appointment. I happened to know the doctor from Temple Emanu-El. We were talking about life with neurodiseases, and she told me that her father had Parkinson's disease. She shared with me the slogan that he had adopted, accommodation without surrender. I have made that my mantra. Strategizing is just that. It is accommodation without surrender. How people perceive me. Amongst one of the saddest things for me since entering the neuro world is the way people perceive me. I don't have any cognitive deficits, but many people assume that due to my physical challenges, that my ability to comprehend things is affected. I've had people who don't know me speak to me like in a childlike voice to be sure that I can comprehend them. I have a pre-written note on my iPad and on my iPhone that says that I have a speech deficit but can hear and understand them perfectly. But often they see in front of them me, and who is not probably capable of understanding much of anything. On the flip side, the kindness of strangers has been overwhelming. I have had to re-examine some of my own prejudices when some stranger goes out of their way to hold a door or to pick something up that I've dropped on the floor. Teens and young adults have surprised me by their acts of kindness without ever being condescending. Even when I'm exercising outside on my hybrid bike wheelchair rig, the kindness of people to stop at a crosswalk is sometimes surprising. Yes, it's the law, but it's not always followed. I am still me, at least on the inside. Relationships. Who are your friends? This question has been interesting to answer. Most of our friends are the best. They accept me and call up to get together. They know how to be helpful without being condescending, how to assist with my walker and to know my strategies. They are the best. Sadly, some of our friends have stopped calling us to do stuff. Are they embarrassed to be seen with me? Are they just not flexible enough to wait for me to walk somewhere at my slow speed? Do they not like that I communicate via an iPad and are embarrassed if I try to speak and they can't understand me? I don't really know the answers to these questions, and I have tried to stop being upset by it. However, if things were reversed, would I be such a fleeting, or should I say a fleeing friend, or one that wants to be a friend unconditionally? Finally, my home life. There is no greater Eshet Chayil, woman of valor, than my wife, Leah. The burdens of our business and home life fall mostly on her shoulders. She is so caring and thoughtful and only wants me to be safe and healthy. I don't even know the words exist to express my gratitude to her. Our partnership has changed. She has an unfair amount of to take care of while I do what I can do. It's not nearly enough. Ironically, I believe that our relationship has grown closer by this challenge. We both have learned to compromise more, and we still like to be with each other and do things together. Clearly, the past 2 months have been quite challenged for all households. We have laughed and talked more than ever. Would I be such a good spouse if the tables were turned? I'd like to think so. My kids and grandkids are the best. My kids, and I include my in-law kids as my kids, are patient, respectful, helpful, and fun. My 10 grandkids only know their Saba as I am now. And as they are learning to read, our relationship is moving to a higher level. That being said, I still get to feed them junk food, let them play on my iPad, and wrestle with them on the floor. I just want to be the best Saba I can be. I am very lucky. I have a wonderful spouse, a great family, caring friends, and a community that is second to none. Thanks for listening.
I think a few of us are a little verklempt right now. Themselves. Rhode Island is neither a road nor an island. Really, I have to take a second.
We're not verklempt.
Sorry?
We're not verklempt.
Thank God. But, oh. So you'll see in the text, in the chats, that people are commenting about how beautiful it was and how meaningful it was and giving us things to think about. And Margaret just said it's true. You haven't lost your very playful personality because I know. I'm usually the one who has to leave shul because we have... I forgot to mention that I asked everybody this morning, or in the last couple of days, what their favorite Emanu-El memory was. Kenny says that there are just like way too many to pick one, but if he had to, if he was forced with his arm tied behind his back and then he couldn't use his walker, so it would be a big problem, that he would say Shayna's wedding. Shayna's wedding only because she was named at Temple Emanu-El on that bima. She became a bat mitzvah on that bima. She got married right there, and all those special moments continue to happen because now he gets to see her every Shabbat with her entire family. So thank you, Kenny. Thank you very much for giving us so much to think about, and you know, and then thank you, Leah, for not letting it be monotone. That was good too. And I will agree that you are an incredible spouse to your husband. So we're going to move on. Our next speaker is Margaret Wall. And Margaret had a couple of things to say about favorite moments, but Margaret's favorite moment didn't actually happen inside Temple Emanu-El, but it happened because of Temple Emanu-El. At her mother's Shiva that happened 14 years ago, she was surrounded by so much love and so much support by so many of us at the temple that was like the most meaningful moment for her. So I'm going to turn it over to Margaret, and thank you so much for being here and sharing your story.
Of course. So, about a year ago, Alyssa Felder asked me to be one of several people talking about our Jewish identity at a Rosh Chodesh dinner at someone's home. There were about 50 women there. It was really lovely. And I gave it a little thought, and I went up and I started talking, and I basically talked and cried the whole time. I really wasn't expecting this. Pam was there. And so for whatever I said in that whole experience, she asked me to do it here. So I'm prepared, and trigger warning. What I talked about at the Rosh Chodesh dinner had to do with my sense of my Jewish identity and the journey with it. So I'll give you a little background history. My father was born in this country. His parents immigrated from Ukraine as teenagers, and he was an only child. They lived a conservative Jewish life, kept kosher, and all of that. He met my mother when he was doing his residency at a hospital in Cincinnati, where she was working as a nurse, and she would find him empty beds where he could sleep when it was on night call and things like that, and was impressed with her kindness to patients that most people would see as unsavory in some respect. So they became in a relationship. Prior to that, for my mom, she had been raised in the Episcopalian faith. And when she was about 16 and she had been singing in the choir, she couldn't sing those words anymore. It didn't suit her, it didn't fit. So she left that church. And then when she and my father were together, she converted. And so they raised us in the Jewish faith. I'm the middle of 5. Now I need a sip of water. And so that was all good. And when I turned, well, let me tell you a little bit about him. I sort of rehearsed this a little bit with Pam. My dad was a physician, my mother was a nurse, and they were interested in science things. So when I was a kid, my father would keep microscope slides in the freezer. And in the winter, we'd go catch snowflakes and look at them under the microscope. And when my mother would prepare a turkey, she'd call me over and she'd dissect the heart and show me the insides and chambers and all of this. So I loved that. I've always been inclined in that direction. It presented a few issues in reference to religion when I was growing up because, well, at Sunday school, when I was 6 maybe, the teacher told the story of Jacob's dream and these angels going up and down a ladder, and I thought, I've got to be careful about what I believe from these people because they're not telling me the truth. I had a friend who was Catholic when I was a bit older, and she wanted me to come inside of her church to appreciate the stained glass windows. So we were going to do that. But she said, we have to put something on our head because if we don't, God will strike us dead with a bolt of lightning. And so I said, well, let's try it. Let's see. But I was wearing a headband for my long hair and she put leaves on her head because she didn't have a hat. So anyway, none of us were struck dead. So when I was 7, my father died of his 3rd heart attack. He was 42. He had his first one at 39. I remember sitting on his bed as a little one while a nurse was checking his blood pressure. People made house calls in those days. I didn't really understand it, but his death was obviously pretty devastating to our family. My mother was 7 months pregnant with the baby. And one of the losses that accompanied him, or along with losing him, we lost connections to certain institutions that he had the association with. And one of them, unfortunately, was our temple. And people did not reach out much. They did not behave in a very supportive way to my mother. And we, at least the older siblings, began to rebel about going to Sunday school. And I was too young to go on the T by myself. So I didn't go either. So from then on, we lived a pretty secular Jewish life and observed holidays. I had friends with whom I'd celebrate Shabbat, but that was about it, except for the fact that my identity was totally, clearly Jewish. I met Vince years later, and both of us happened to be, I'm in a family of 5, he's from a family of 4, and we're the only Jewish identified child in those families. His mother is from Russia. She went from Russia to Shanghai to San Francisco, where they met, and his father is an Irish Catholic. So he was Jewish, and he had a little exposure to both, but mostly secular Jewish. So, but we both had a very clear Jewish identity, and when we had children, we sent them to Schechter, and some years after that, we joined Temple Emanu-El. And it's been a good place for me. I've gotten involved, you know, in the board and so forth. But the thing that I keep struggling with, and it may be that science business, maybe not, is I don't understand what goes on for people in the sanctuary during services. And it's not that it isn't because of science. I understand that those are 2 separate paths, and I appreciate that. It's that I am not able to get a feeling that I'm praying, and when I see people that appear to be immersed in it, I can't imagine what they're experiencing. And it kind of fascinates me, actually. And which is unfortunate, because you know how they say the 2 things you can't talk about are politics and religion or something? You can just talk about the weather. So I'm afraid to ask people, because I'm afraid they'll think I'm challenging or criticizing. But I'm not. I'm just intrigued. And, you know, I've thought to myself, if this doesn't, you know, if those things don't work for me, but I really like Torah study, and I like singing in the choral group when my schedule permits, and I like a lot of the learning opportunities and the interactive things. But the services, I have trouble with some of the repetition, and the length is often too long, you know, on Shabbat morning for me. And so I could leave that behind and just focus on what I like, but I can't. I don't know why, but it intrigues me. And in fact, one of the elements of my consulting work is to work with the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island and the Rhode Island Conference for the United Church of Christ, doing psychological evaluations of people who want to be priests, deacons, ministers in those churches. And so I love being able to talk with them about their spiritual journeys in addition to the whole psychological stuff. It just really intrigues me. So back to the Rosh Chodesh, I told the story of that family history and cried through the whole thing. And everybody was really supportive. And then sometime after, as I continued to reflect on it, I realized that I had thought I dealt with his death years ago. It was 60 years ago, just about. And the only other time I remember having this welling up of feeling about him was when my son was born, because he was part of him, you know? I was holding a bit of his genes and his flesh and blood in a certain way. But I didn't realize how deep this well of grief and love were inside of me. And I just was really surprised by that. And I realized that that's my sort of grounding in the Jewish faith. It's a tie to my history, to my family. It's why it meant so much to me when I first went to the Wailing Wall. I thought of him and I started to cry. So I appreciate that for giving me the connection to the faith. And unlike when he died and we lost that community, I feel like I've rediscovered the community at Emanu-El and am able to have those connections and community that continues that long legacy. And so, you know, I just feel like that is a gift that connects me to all of you, to the synagogue, and also to my dad, because it transcends time. He's still there.
So Margaret, thank you so much for sharing your story. And at today's Zman Kodesh, Alan Flam talked about, what is this whole idea of Mechaye Metim, that God is the giver of life to the dead. And we talked about how some of it has to do with memory, that because your dad, because you still remember, because you can still share stories about him, he's still with us. So we're thankful for him and his influence on your life, and certainly for you to be here tonight. Moving right along, because I know that I tend to talk way too much, I'm going to turn it over to Carol Bar Saros. And when I asked her what her favorite Emanu-El moment is or was, she said that it was, though she said she thought it sounded cliche, which it isn't, she said it was her son's B'nai Mitzvah for very different reasons. But one theme that was for both of them had to do with the community coming to her, and people she knew and people she didn't know, guests and people who weren't guests, just celebrating with her the accomplishments of her son. So we're going to turn it over to Carol, and looking forward to hearing your wonderful story.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate, honestly, being asked to speak tonight. And when Pam first called me, I was like, Pam, I really don't have any stories to tell, honestly. But turns out that I have a bunch. There were a lot of choices on stories. There was the story about coming to Rhode Island, the Rhode Island story about 33 years ago, all in the same month. I graduated from medical school and I got married and I moved to my first house and started internal medicine residency all in the same month. Or I could talk about having two sons, the second of which was born with severe physical and cognitive challenges, as well as profound deafness. But I don't want to talk about those things. Tonight, I want to talk to you about my dad. My dad was a really amazing guy. He was bright and he was sensitive and he loved people and learning about the world, and he loved to tell a good joke, and that guy could tell a story. I thought of him as superhuman, but like most people, actually, he was super, but he was also very human. He also was a workaholic. And this served him really well because his first job was in Harlem in New York City, where he was a teacher, and he was extremely passionate about what he did. He loved his students. He loved teaching. He believed in education. And if the kids didn't show up to class or they started to get in trouble, he would go to their parents' house and just try to talk to the parents. And it was always kind of funny because in his night table next to his bed, he had a really great collection of penknives that he had confiscated from that experience. My parents moved to Maryland, where he became the youngest principal of an elementary school in the United States at that time. And then because of his talents, he went on to work at the National Education Association as an editor of publications. But at the age of 36, he had a very distinguished addition to his resume, that he developed Parkinson's. And he was the youngest person, or one of the youngest people known to have Parkinson's. And at that time, there was no treatment. I was 3 years old, the baby of 4 kids. The oldest was 12. My dad, the workaholic, angry and depressed, he threw himself into work. And he would come home from NEA really with nothing left to deal with the family. So my mother became the caretaker of him, and struggled to deal with a diverse 4 kids. And needless to say, there was a little tension in the house. So my dad decided to become an experimental patient at the National Institutes of Health. He decided to do this for himself, but also because the kind of person he was a real giver, and he wanted to try to make things better if he could for other people with Parkinson's. So he was one of the first 12 people in the world to try L-Dopa, and had to take medication every 2 hours, round the clock, but it worked. It worked for him. Wow. And so he would go from being stiff, unable to walk, usually having to lie down wherever he was, whether it was at the mall or at a theater. He would have to lie down on the floor. It might be at work. And sorry, we're at home. So anyway, then he would take his magic pill, and it might be minutes of lying on the floor, or it could be an hour. Suddenly he would pop up like a jack in the box and start walking. And but the medication also had side effects. And so one of the side effects for him was these choreiform movements, or dance-like movements, called dyskinesia, which he would have sort of dance-like movements of his arms and his head and his legs all at once. And this roller coaster of stiff and loose would go on many times during the day. And it was extremely difficult for him, and also for the family to watch, and also to watch the stares of onlookers. So 11 years after getting the diagnosis, the next blow came, because the NEA, because of the Parkinson's, and they had done their best, but they asked him to take an early retirement, which he did. And it was quite devastating for him, obviously, and for my mom as well. But he ultimately took this opportunity to reinvent himself. And he started writing a book about being an experimental patient with Parkinson's, and how he personally lived and coped with Parkinson's, everything like Kenny was talking about, from dealing with your kids, to your sex life, to whatnot. And if you want the gory details, you can read the book. Oh, I forgot to bring a copy. I have a lot of copies if anybody wants to read it. But during this time of reinvention, he developed the phrase and mantra that he lived by, that you heard Kenny mention, that accommodation without surrender. And this, like Kenny, was what he lived by, and he lived with this for the rest of his life. He, over a period of years, did complete the book, and it, you know, sold tens of thousands of copies. It was a wonderful thing for him personally, and also allowed him to then go around the country and talk to people about living with Parkinson's. And he developed the first support group for Parkinsonians in the Washington, D.C. area. And then he became, over time, a motivational speaker and went around the country, even with the Parkinsons, to work with other Parkinsonians in developing support groups in their area. But 4 years into his reinvention, something happened that none of us expected. My mom, who was 52 at that time, developed breast cancer. And the caretaker of my dad and of us all, after a fairly short course, she died. And we all really wondered how we were going to go on at our various points in life, and particularly how my dad was going to go on. But being the guy that he was, he did. And he came across the writings of Norman Cousins, who was a journalist who developed a debilitating illness himself, and then cured himself through using megadoses of vitamin C and humor. And my dad really took this to heart, and it was really another transforming moment for him, or period or whatnot, that he decided he didn't want to be the depressed, angry, sick guy the rest of his life. And he was going to take that joke part and just, you know, run with it. And he really found that laughter helped decrease his Parkinson's symptoms, excuse me. So I'm going to share with you one of his stories that he loved to tell, was that he used to like to play golf. And he would go to the public course because they take everybody there. And in the beginning of his illness, he could only complete like one hole or maybe two, either from stiffness or because he had extra movements from the side effects of the medication. And over many years, it's hard to sum up a transformation of 30 years in 5 minutes, I just want to say. But anyway, over many years, after many years, they developed another medication that took away some of that dyskinesia, and he was a little bit more controlled, and he was actually able to finish 9 holes of golf. So he finished the 9 holes. He's walking off the golf course. He goes past the entrance little booth, and this man inside leans out and he goes, "I'm really glad that you finally got some help with that drinking problem." So my dad had a lot of stories. Anyway, despite everything that happened in my dad's life, he called himself Lucky Sid. And that luck was there for us and my dad, because he lived with Parkinson's for 33 years and died at 67 of complications a month after my first son was born, Sam. But he was able to get to the bris, and that was one of the happiest moments in his life and in ours. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that I feel really lucky having had Lucky Sid as my dad. And in dealing with the challenges in my own life, I feel really fortunate to have been in the front row seat with this incredible guy, my dad, and learned that you really can view the cup as half full the incredible power of humor, and that accommodation without surrender is often the best medicine. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. That was wonderful. And I'm sorry I never got to meet Lucky Sid, but, you know, hearing everyone's stories really helps, you know, give a depth of flavor to all of our relationships with each other. And it's really so brave of you to share, and so inspiring for us. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Bill Miles, and I know that you all know who he is. And I asked him what his favorite Emanu-El moment was. And this is what he said, and I wrote it down. Normally I do this off the cuff, but Bill was very specific about what he said. He said that his favorite Emanu-El moment was bringing Jews from Nigeria and Cameroon to Temple Emanu-El, and bringing Rabbi Franklin and Anne to Africa and guiding them through Jewish Nigeria. So Bill had told me recently that he was just about ready to start another book on a transformative experience that he had. And so what better place to start sharing it than here? So Bill, the floor is yours. As soon as we find you, I guess.
Am I there? Yep.
Mhm.
So, am I there?
You're there, we
Pam?
can see you and we can hear you.
Okay, great. So, just want to, very important about introducing me is that I am married to Louisa Miles. I'm the father of Ariel, who's 32, and Samuel, who's 30 years old. I'll give you a second to figure out the math. No more time. They were born in 1989 and 1987, the other way around. But I want to talk about the year that I was truly changed into a parent. And that was in 1991. So in 1991, we were living on a South Pacific island, the island nation called Vanuatu. And this was way before Vanuatu became known as the first venue for Survivor, that television program. And in 1991, and just to prove that I was there then, well, it was only 11 years old as an independent nation. So it's like the United States was in 1787. So in 1787, the US didn't have television, and Vanuatu in 1991 didn't have television. It barely had telephone, and I pulled out the telephone directory from then. And if you want to see all the people in Vanuatu who had telephones then, that's it, the whole country. So it's a remote archipelago. It's really wild. It's 80 some odd islands, mountainous jungle. And even it's so remote that even today, it's only one of half a dozen countries in the world that has not a single registered case of COVID-19. But some of the islands were more remote than others. And one in particular is the island of Tanna. And I left Louisa with kids, taking a bush plane to that island. And Ariel and Sammy, they were 4 and 2 years old at the time. Bush taxis, by the way, they had no real schedule. And once I was stranded on an island because the plane didn't come as scheduled, and had no idea when it would come back. So like confinement now, I think, lockdown, you never know when it's going to end, and just wait, looking day after day, or trying to hear the plane arrive. Anyway, the island of Tanna was known for its really fierce rejection of anything modern. They would cling to what they called custom. Now, custom in Vanuatu, on the island of Tanna in particular, took many forms. One was what they call a cargo cult, where people believe, and in this case, they believe fervently that starting from the 1930s, a prophetic figure was going to come from America and bring all sorts of prosperity to them. No, they didn't think it was me. They had a name. His name was John From. Why John From? John from America, perhaps. Some of them believed that Prince Philip of the English monarchy, that he was their god or demigod. And others believed that what was most important was just clinging to the way that their ancestors dressed before the missionaries came and made them wear clothes. These were people who believed in the maintenance of what they called the Nambas. So I've got a couple of Nambas here. And this is all what the men would wear. That was it. Covering up the most important member of the body, at least for the men. So when I arrived in Tanna, one of the anthropologists of the island, of the country, had given me the name of the main custom leader. His name was Chief Tuk. So try to imagine Chief Tuk. He must have been in his late 50s, maybe late 60s. He had brown skin, crinkly white hair, bulging eyes, very charismatic when he spoke and when he closed his eyes, very intense concentration look, and spoke with very expansive gestures. But the most striking thing about his physical appearance were his, and I'm just assuming we don't have youngsters listening in, he had huge bloated testicles. And that was because Chief Tuk was suffering from elephantiasis. But it didn't dampen his spirit, not in the least. I have this image of him smoking a pipe. He would take pure ash out of the fire. That was the only source of power for cooking, for light, for anything. And he would tell these stories about how Tanna itself was the center of the world, that the northern part of the island was where when creation began, where our story of Genesis, their story of Genesis comes together, but they call it the god Mariktik. And he took a piece of the northern part of Tanna and he flung it out into the ocean, and that piece broke apart and became all the other continents in the world. And it was from Tanna that Noah built his ark when the big flood came, and people all around the world had to swim and swim and swim, and the salt water was so irritating to the skin that they scratched until their skin turned white. And he said, that's the origin of the white man. So I'm taking pictures this whole time. I'm taking pictures of Chief Tuk. I'm taking pictures of the custom school where kids would learn all of this ancient wisdom, but also learn French grammar. And then I would take audio when Chief Tuk would tell other stories about heaven Heaven is not in the sky, he'd say, speaking pidgin English, bislama. Heaven, hemi no stop, odsam, on top, hemi underneath. In other words, heaven is under the island of Tana. And when John Frum or some other prophet comes back, it will reverse itself, and the heaven under Tana will rise to heaven. And then we will enter new paradise which had been hidden all along under the island. And it was Chief Took who initiated me into the island beverage called kava, which is a mild narcotic made out of the root of the tuber, cousin of the potato. But now you can get it in CVS in capsule form because it really is a relaxing ingredient. But on the island of Tana, they prepared kava in the traditional way. A young virgin boy would chew the Piper methysticum, as it's called in Latin, the kava tuber, and spit it out, and mixed with his saliva and the saliva of other young boys, they would mix it in water, and you would drink it out of a coconut shell, and that's how people would bond. And I'm taking pictures the whole time because this stuff is it's incredible. It's unbelievable. And I go to the mountain where there's a live volcano. And if you've ever looked into a live volcano where the explosions are coming up and from the bottom, and these ballistic pieces of molten lava are hurling at you, that's a life-changing experience just there. And I'm taking pictures because it's now or never. And so I decide that I'd had enough. It was time to go back. I spent a week on this island. And I'm in Port Vila with Ariel and Sammy and, of course, Louisa, describing all this. And I'm describing it because I haven't gotten my film developed yet. And then I hear a squealing sound, laughter, infant, toddler squeal. And out of the corner of my eye, I see that it's Sammy. And he's delighted and he's having so much fun because he's pulling out from the film container the film on which I had taken all of these pictures. I don't know how he was able to get that little tip, but he did. Exposed the film, ruined it. So my emotions were a real conflict. I felt rage, I felt hurt, betrayal, frustration, loss. But where would I direct these feelings? At my toddler, my son? I wanted to give him the biggest zets on his tuchus that he had ever gotten up until then, but I couldn't. I loved him. My flesh, he's my blood, it's my future. I'm feeling love and love. At the same time, I'm feeling all of these other terrible, terrible feelings. And that's the moment moment that Tana tested me on, that I really changed into a parent, that I really began to adapt into fatherhood and became, I hope, a fairly good parent to my children ever since.
Thank you so much, Bill. You know, you certainly brought an international flair to our storytelling tonight. And but the equalizer is that those of us who have become parents have all had those moments. Mine was when my son decided to take my Lennox China and play the cymbals with them. Yeah. So I'm going to move right along because I know we're running a little bit late, and Dee Dee has an important story that she wants to share. And when I talked to Dee Dee about what her moment at Temple Emanu-El was, she said this: she had been working so hard on raising funds to make the Leah Eliash Torah, and she felt like she was never going to be able to see it through because, of course, it happened around the same time as her beloved Gary's accident happened. And Rabbi Franklin walked with the scribe into the ICU and finished the Torah with Gary being present. And that for her was the most amazing moment. Seconded only by doing her first Aliyah on Simchas Torah and being scared, more fearful about that than anything else in her life. So I'm going to turn it over to Dee Dee, and I am looking forward to hearing your story. Thank you so much for being with us. And it's so nice that your brother-in-law and sister-in-law from New Jersey are with us tonight. And I saw Amanda was on the line as well, so that's great.
All right, so I hope the other kids are online too. So I wouldn't be me. If, I wouldn't be me if I didn't make some dirty joke about the big ball. Here tonight, everyone, every survivor, every patient, everyone has big balls for doing this. So thank you all. So this is what date night looks like, I guess, on Zoom. I dressed up, I put on makeup. The last time I had makeup on in 3 months was when I had to test drive a car a couple of weeks ago, and I needed to at least have a decent face for the poor salesman. So here we are. As many of you know, 11 years ago now, my husband, Dr. Gary B Whitman, suffered a life-altering accident when the one day he goes to the beach every summer, a rogue wave hit him from behind as his back was to the horizon. And there's a story to go with this. So it was a blisteringly hot day that particular day. I was chairman, I think, of the 5K race at the JCC. I had just done my practice run, and but I called him at the office and I said, "You want to blow the rest of the day off and let's go to the beach?" And he said, "Absolutely, let's go." Now, normally for years and years, we'd belonged to Narragansett, but they threw us all out, those of us who didn't have property in the city, and despite my being a member for 30 years. So I clearly wasn't going back to Narragansett. We were going to a wonderful little place in Little Compton. The way before we got onto the highway, a dear friend of ours from Pittsburgh was in town in Narragansett visiting her mom, and she said, "Come join us at Narragansett." And I had said, "Nope, have no interest in going." But Gary said, no, I want to go. I want to see her. I want to see her mother. So instead of taking 195 East, we took 95 South, and off to Narragansett we went. we had lunch with the family, and then we went to the beach. And it was a very strange day. The weather was, something was up, but the beach was open. The waves were very the water. He's chest high in the water, so he's not that terribly far out at all. And I go out to meet him, and all of a sudden a wind came along and blew my hat off. And he turns to face the shore, and he's looking for his hat, and his head is down. And all of a sudden this rogue wave, as I said before, comes, and it carries me to shore. And when I looked up from the shore, I saw Gary floating face down, just as you see in the movies. I mean, the arms were over, the head's in the water. I know that I have a minute, if that, to literally get to him, to pull his head up, to prevent brain damage. And I have to tell you, the reason I fell in love with Gary was because of his brain to be intact. So I all but walked on water, and a stranger from 10 feet away see that we're struggling. He helps me carry him to shore. We pull him in, we dragged him up on the beach, and we turned him over, and he said 4 things to me. These are the following things he said to me in this order. He said, "I'm paralyzed. Get me to Boston. I don't want to die, and I love you." And I'm thinking to myself, what do you mean you're paralyzed? What are you talking about? You're paralyzed. Ambulance comes. In the hospital, we get to exactly, he's still conscious, tells me exactly what size tube he wanted with. And I tell the doctor that. So, okay. Then they kick me out, and he is intubated, and we try to get a helicopter to airlift him to Boston. And there is a copter sitting in the parking lot, but they couldn't get a pilot. So he has to be transferred to Rhode Island Hospital. And we get to the hospital, and a dear friend who is an anesthesiologist meets us there. And I'm still in my suit covered with sand. And I know just from one of the exams they did that this is really not good, and maybe he is paralyzed. Anyhow, we meet with a doctor. The doctor tells me he doesn't even think he's going to make it through the 24 hours. And he tells me his spinal cord is transected, which in my head means like he's dead already. But he makes it through the 24 hours, but behind the scenes, we're trying desperately to get him into Boston, which is no easy feat. Once you're in a Rhode Island hospital, it's very difficult to go across the state and be accepted into another hospital. But through the efforts of another dear, dear, dear friend, we were able to do that. So he was helicoptered to Boston. He was in ICU. He was in that hospital for 3 weeks on a respirator, and he was in a coma for about 2 weeks. And this is the only reason I mentioned the big balls, because he was given so much fluid. I never saw anything like this in my entire life, which eventually he lost, obviously, that weight, the fluid weight. Okay, so we're there. We have to interview where Gary is going to be doing his rehab. Name of the hospital in Atlanta, and then there's Craig out in Colorado. And they're the only 3 that really take traumatic spinal cord injuries. We chose to go to Colorado because we always used to ski in Colorado. The hospital has a remarkable reputation for, again, traumatic brain injuries and traumatic spinal cord injuries. So we get medevaced, and I must say the plane was probably the size of our kitchen table, and we actually have to make an emergency landing to take care of some problems and to get some more fuel. And those who know me too know that family members died sadly in a plane crash. So I'm thinking, lightning just can't strike twice. We managed to get off, we go to Colorado, and it just was so interesting because we go through a covered garage in Boston to the airplane, to another covered garage in Colorado at the hospital, at Craig Hospital. And I know this is going to be my place and his place for the next 3 months. And you have to become, in a way, very political. You have to know who is critical to his well-being. You have to know which aide is going to wash him. You have to be so nice. You have to be smart. So not only do we have the injury, you have the politics that go around with the injury. And so Craig was a remarkable rehab hospital, but at the same time, while he was getting his intensive physical therapy, I was getting the beginning of my medical degree. And they were very clear that those who came with the injured party had to go to classes, had to learn things, because they assured us that we would know more about a spinal cord injury when we left than most physicians. And as it turned out, they were right. Anyhow, I'll tell you a quick funny story about one of the meetings there. So you're get together by the level of injury you have. So quadriplegics are all together, which I must say Gary was a quadriplegic, a full-on quadriplegic. And then they have T1 to something in another room. But in the introductory meeting, we all go around telling who we are and what the level of injury is. And then everyone's a quadriplegic until they get to someone and they talk about their son, who sadly wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He was thrown out, and he is a T, I forget, which means he can move his entire upper body. Well, the entire group of people who belong to quadriplegics in unison said, "Is that all?" So that's how you become so quickly accommodated to what your new life is going to be. At Craig, they were able to take him off the respirator, and he eventually was able to be taken off a trach. He was, that also they could take out the feeding tube. And it's just crazy what you go through. You learn, you really learn. This is your new world. And while we're there, he has to be fitted for his power wheelchair. And in those days, many of you saw him, he had it with the mouth control, with the breath control. And they found a wheelchair there and they fitted him for it. And now all of a sudden, insurance comes into our lives. And so not only am I his partner, and they've designated me as his caretaker, and that's a word I despise, because I just think of him as he and I are partners. I never fancied myself as a wife, and I was probably a crappy wife, but I was a remarkable partner. And so they won't let us buy the wheelchair that's literally 3 floors below. They insist that we have to buy the wheelchair from a vendor back east in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. This is all during Christmas week. We're now going to be released on Christmas Day. They send the wheelchair to Craig Hospital in Colorado, and you can be sure none of the staff is eager to be doing anything around Christmas week. The mechanic comes up and he shows me in an hour how to take the wheelchair apart and how to put it back together again. He tells me, look carefully. So we then take it apart again and we have to wrap it up because it has to go home with us the following day on Christmas back to Rhode Island. So now I'm a partner, I'm a caretaker, I'm a mechanic, and now I become the business manager of his injury. And that was the toughest of all, I have to tell you. And I would wake up and chew glass for breakfast before I would take on or talk to any of the insurance people. We get home safely. Everybody's so happy to see us. I think it snowed 2 feet that night. It was crazy. He was sleeping in the dining room. We didn't know if we could keep the house before we made any revisions. And so it is. A couple of years go by. We've done renovations to the house, and they're holding the International Spinal Cord meeting, the Worldwide International Spinal Cord meeting in Europe, and he wants to go. So we pack up and we go to Europe, and we go, and I'm thinking, what is he, on crack? I mean, we're going to go to Europe, we're going to go to London. And of course, the wheelchair gets broken on the plane because no baggage handler in the world listens to you on how to store the wheelchair. Okay, we get to London. We actually have a ball. He's at meetings. It was a remarkable week. London was the most handicap-friendly city I've ever been to, and that was great. We come home, he rehabs, he's doing better, but he's still a full-on quadriplegic. We go to Baltimore for another rehab at the Kennedy Krieger, where he's trying to get off the mouthpiece and do hand, but he can't. He just keeps going in circles. Eventually, he gets off the mouthpiece and he's able to do the hand with some caution. We had a fight, which we don't think I'm an angel. I was always me with the injury. We had a fight, and I think it was after one of the hurricanes here. And I come in the house and he's missing. And I get in the car and I drive up and down the street, and one neighbor is out, and I said, you didn't happen to see a wheelchair and a quadriplegic go by, did you? And she said, yes, I actually think I saw him go that way. Anyhow, I was able to catch up with him only because one of the trees had fallen and blocked his way. Okay. Then he wants to go to the Thousand Islands in Canada. This is another year later. We always used to travel extensively, and he just wanted to be normal. So we go to the Thousand Islands in Canada. Now, if anyone's ever been there, you know, it's 1,000 islands and you have to get anywhere by boat. And he specifically wanted to see the Bolt Castle, which was some homage that some billionaire, that was the guy who started the Waldorf Astoria, made to his wife. And she suddenly died, and so that was the end of the castle. But in order for us to get there, we had to take a little ferry. But when I tell you a ferry, it was a shuttle. It was the smallest thing I'd ever seen that was legally allowed to carry passengers. The captain asked everyone on the boat to get to the other side, because when he was coming on with his 350-pound wheelchair and him, the boat was going to waver a little bit. But there was space between the dock and the boat, and there was this tiniest little ramp, and I'm really terrified. I'm thinking, what if he goes over? So I unstrap him because if God forbid he went into the water, this way at least hopefully he'd be able to float to the top, and I certainly could dive in after him to get him. And son of a gun, we took a running start and he made it. And it was incredible. And we got on the boat, got off the boat, and we had a marvelous trip. And life was what life was. Again, we didn't know what life was going to be. We did. Gary happened in an emergent fashion. And that was evidenced. We were in Washington. He was at a meeting, and another spinal cord meeting, and he has his first seizure, and it was a full-on seizure. And I never saw in my life he was actually going to and was in Washington. He had had a pacemaker put in the year earlier in Boston. Don't start me on that. And this hospital didn't have a PET scan, which could see what was really going on because of the pacemaker. There's only like 10 in the country. Anyhow, I sign him out against medical advice, and we go to Johns Hopkins. We drive to Johns. Remember, I asked them, and campus. He has a second seizure. I call 911, and in my life, this is the truth. We're placed on the phone. There's security. I said, call rescue, get him over. They got him, and I went with him, and he had a third seizure in the emergency room. We were there for a week, unexpectedly for a week, and when we were discharged at the end of the week, he had 2 ports hanging out through his neck, and he also had medicine, one of which had to be given every 2 hours and the other every 4 hours. So we're driving home. I have to pull over at the rest stop. I come up to the port, and we have to wait there till we see that it's running smoothly. And we did it. We drove home. I mean, this stuff will either kill you or it'll just make you better. And that was that. But I have to tell you, I had an advantage, and this is where you say things are meant to be. And I know there's no such thing, it's our choices. But for whatever reason, I chose Gary he loved science, he loved medicine. And again, I tell you, that brain is what turned me on. And it's because I met him in his first year of interning and paid attention to everything that he did, that I was very comfortable in hospitals. I was very comfortable talking to physicians. I always knew to ask, what's the upside, what's the downside? And I did my research. And so at least that wasn't intimidating. It was actually, I took a lead in his care. And for some reason, he trusted me, and it's probably the greatest compliment he ever could have given me. All right, we're home from that. Now he wants to go to Georgia. He has a meeting down there somewhere, so we fly to Georgia. We're staying at a lovely hotel, and one morning we're going down for breakfast. This was our 3rd day there, and we'd always spent a day, we'd always spent breakfast and back in a little cubby. And I said to him, let's just have breakfast in the main dining room. And he says, no, no, no. Anyone who knows Gary, he's stubborn and he does what he wants, and he's in that power wheelchair, so he's going where he wants. He goes by the buffet table, and I don't know what happened, but he goes into the buffet table. And again, I remind you, this is the 350-pound wheelchair. He is now under the buffet table with his gear caught in drive. The table goes up, 200 dishes go up, the buffet canisters go over, and the sterno, which is still flaming, goes up too. And I'm drenched now. I mean, every pore in my body is sweating. And I'm trying to reach the handle to get him in reverse, which of course I can't reach because it's stuck under the table. So I flip a switch, the emergency switch, we turn it off. I manually, and this is no easy feat, get him the wheelchair back to another place. I have a couple of $100 in my pocket. I literally go to the front desk. I get 10s and 20s. And anyone who works at that restaurant is being handed a 10 or a 20 who just looks at me with a smile or with some sense of pity. And he got through it. I mean, I wanted to kill him until I knew that he was septic. And I didn't know that till we got home. And that was the first time he was septic. And that very often can happen with the two leading causes of death for spinal cord injuries, of course, is urinary tract infections and pneumonia. So we bit the bullet on that. We survived that. It just, when I tell you it was crazy, it was crazy. I don't know. I loved being with him. I loved learning from him. He just was my guy, as much as I wanted to kill him. And again, I was very fortunate to be with someone who really loved science. And as much as he loved science, I'm sitting there with hope. I mean, I don't know when it hit me that he would never walk again. And I remember, Margaret, you talk about prayers. When I first got to Craig, I'm looking in the mirror and I said, please God, let him have his brain, let him have his breath, let him have his hands. And those are the three things I prayed for. And it's interesting, in the Wall Street Journal the other day, they had an article on prayer, how it physically helps people. And Margaret, I don't know a thing in Hebrew. I've already blown off second Hebrew class. But I love being in temple. I love being with, ask Pam when we go to Minyan. I'm the bad girl, I sit in back, but there's something very soothing to be there. And I need to talk with the rabbi about hope, because hope really keeps you going. And so do friends, so does family. I hope I set an example to my 3 kids and to their spouses what a partnership is about. And let me tell you something. Many things in this accident had nothing to do with love. It had to do with like. Where am I to be? What I had to do, you had to like the guy. Love had nothing to do with it. And I just want to say, it was a remarkable adventure. I loved Gary dearly. I hope he knew that. And I don't know. I thank you all. I don't know what more to say. I hope.
Didi, I think you've said it all and more.
You want to know what I learned from this. I said to Pam, I don't know, everyone says when things like this happen, you say you don't want to sweat the little stuff. Don't sweat the little stuff. I'd like to think, am I as nice? Am I nicer? I'd like to think that I was always. Am I any less crazy than I ever was? I think I'm crazier now. But to say is, if he were alive now and if he were able-bodied, he'd be working 24/7 in the emergency department, which is the physician that he was, trying to come up with something for COVID. And I say in all seriousness, my 9 years with Gary and this injury is nothing compared to people who are losing loved ones without notice. People are dying alone. People are losing people that they can't see before they die. And we as Jews can't sit shiva. You can't have a eulogy that can tell to all your friends and family what a wonderful person that deceased person is. So I hope we all stick together. No one should go through life alone. That's what our community is, and that's what our synagogue is. And Pam, thank you for having me talk. I hope I didn't go on endlessly. Sometimes I can.
Dee Dee, thank you so much for sharing your story. You know, so many of us knew bits and pieces of it from afar, and it's really wonderful to hear so many rich details. I thank everybody who has been on the Zoom conference today. First of all, thank you to all of our storytellers, to Kenny and to Leah, who actually spoke for him, to Margaret, to Carol, to Bill, and to Dee Dee. Thank you all for sharing your times of inspiration. And thank you all 60 some odd people who are sitting here for an hour and a half listening to us. So thanks again, and have a story-worthy week.
Take care.
Beautiful evening. Thank you for getting it together.
Amazing. Amazing.
I'm glad that you joined us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
And by the way, if anybody out there has a story and they want to tell it, we'll do it. We'll do another one, but we might practice a little bit more to make sure that people stay to, you know, I won't have such a rich program. We'll do it for people or something.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
For all of your help.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And thank you to all the speakers. You guys are amazing.
Wonderful program.
Yeah, 1 minute. I hope I have the right number.